On Christmas Eve, my son looked me in the eyes and said, "You shouldn't have come. You're not part of this family anymore." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands, still holding the pie I'd spent hours baking, began to tremble. The snow outside hadn't yet melted from my coat, and already the warmth I'd carried in my heart was gone. I had arrived early, like I always did. 15 years in a row, I'd been the first one through that door. Even after my wife passed, I never missed a single Christmas. I would walk the same path from the bus stop, holding my small, carefully wrapped gift in one hand and her famous pecan pie, now my humble version of it, in the other. This year was no different, at least on the surface, but I should have seen the signs. When I stepped onto the porch, the wreath on the door was different, no longer the handmade one my late wife had crafted. Instead, it was something modern, cold, store-bought. The lights didn't blink with that soft golden hue anymore. They were sharp, sterile, the kind that screamed decoration, not welcome. Still, I rang the bell with a smile. My heart remembered laughter, music, the sound of grandkids running into my arms. The door opened, but not with joy. My son's face held no warmth, not even forced politeness, just discomfort, as if I were someone from the past who showed up where he no longer belonged. "You're early," he said flatly. "I wanted to help," I replied, holding up the pie. "Like always." He nodded stiffly and stepped aside. Inside, everything was beautiful, perfectly arranged, polished, but none of it felt alive. It wasn't our Christmas anymore. It was a magazine cover. I took off my coat, careful not to drip melted snow on the rug, and moved to the fireplace, the heart of every holiday we'd shared. The chair was still there. My chair. Not mine by ownership, but by tradition. My wife used to save it for me, with a hand-knitted throw draped over the armrest. Every year she'd say, "That's where your father sits." I hung my coat on the back like I always did, sat down slowly, placed the pie on the coffee table. It still smelled of cinnamon in memory. No one else was in the room. From the kitchen I heard faint voices, unfamiliar. Laughter, but not the kind that invited me in. I sat quietly, hands folded, eyes on the fire. The flames danced, but I didn't feel their heat. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, I sat alone, like a relic in a home that had outgrown me. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? If this story touches your heart, consider subscribing and sharing it. That's how you help us grow this channel and keep telling stories that matter. And now, let's continue. The warmth I had hoped to find never came. I sat by the fireplace, watching the flames curl and shift, but they gave me no comfort. The house was full. Laughter echoed from the kitchen, the clink of glasses, the muffled thump of footsteps on polished floors. Yet it all felt distant, like I was listening through a thick pane of glass. Present, but not included. My son passed through the living room once, barely meeting my eyes. He gave a brief nod like I was a delivery man dropping something off. No smile. No, "Glad you're here, Dad." Just a ghost of acknowledgement. And then he disappeared into the next room. The chair creaked softly beneath me as I shifted, holding the wooden box I'd carved for my grandson. I'd spent 3 evenings sanding it smooth, etching a simple compass rose on the lid. A boy should have something to keep his treasures in. I looked at it now, sitting untouched on my lap. No one had asked what it was. No one even noticed it. His wife passed by next. She didn't say a word. Her eyes brushed over me like I was furniture. She adjusted the garland on the mantel and walked away without pause. I had known her since she was 20. I remembered the day they told me she was pregnant. I cried on that very chair, and now she couldn't look at me. I heard the kids upstairs. Their laughter used to bring the house to life, shrieking with joy when Grandpa showed up with peppermint candies and told stories by the fire. I smiled faintly, hoping they'd run down any minute now, wrap their arms around my neck and pull me into their world again. But they didn't. They stayed upstairs. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Still, no one came to sit with me. No one asked if I wanted something to drink. No one said, "It's good to have you here." They were avoiding me, all of them, and I couldn't understand why. I stood and wandered into the hallway. I heard voices, my son's, tense and low. I stopped when I recognized my name. I just don't want him here the whole night. It changes the vibe. He doesn't belong anymore. I backed away slowly, like I hadn't heard anything, like my heart wasn't cracking. I returned to my chair and sat down again, carefully placing the wooden box on the table beside the pie. My hands rested in my lap. I forced myself to breathe slowly. In, outside, in, outside. Maybe they were just stressed. Maybe the holidays had worn them thin. So many people, so much planning. That must be it. I tried to believe it. I needed to believe it. Because the alternative, that they had grown tired of me, that they no longer saw me as family, was too painful to bear. And so I waited, silent, still. A guest in the house I once helped build. The house felt colder than it should have on Christmas. Not from the weather. The heat was on, the fire still flickered, but from something deeper, something unspoken that hung in the air like frost. A presence not welcome, a silence too loud. I stood from the fireplace thinking maybe I could make myself useful, bring some plates, ask if they needed help carving the roast. That's what my wife would have done. She'd never let herself be idle in a house full of people. As I made my way down the hallway, I noticed a door slightly ajar. One of the side rooms. Maybe they were wrapping a last-minute gift or storing coats. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my name. He's just embarrassing. My son's voice, clear, cold. My heart stopped. I didn't even want him to come this year, he continued, his voice low but sharp. Every time he talks, it's like he drags us back into the past. He doesn't understand things anymore. He just doesn't belong here. There was a pause, then a softer voice, his wife, agreeing almost apologetically. I know, but he's your dad. What were we supposed to do? He always shows up. I stood frozen in the hallway, feet planted like stone, eyes fixed on the sliver of light through the door crack. The voices inside didn't stop. They didn't lower. They didn't hesitate, as if they never imagined I'd be close enough to hear. Or maybe they didn't care if I did. They spoke of me like I was a problem to manage, not a person, not the man who raised him alone after his mother died, not the father who gave up vacations, weekends, and health to put food on the table and keep the lights on. Just an old man who no longer fit in their world of polished counters and perfect dinner parties. I stepped back slowly, one careful foot after another. The floor creaked softly under my weight. I didn't want them to hear me now. I didn't want them to know I had been standing there, absorbing every word. My heart felt like glass. If I moved too suddenly, it might shatter. Back in the living room, I sank into my chair again. The wooden box still rested untouched. The pie sat unopened. My coat, still damp from the snow, hung limp over the back of the chair. I stared into the fire, but it no longer danced. It just flickered without meaning, shadows twisting across the walls like echoes of a life that no longer had a place here. And in that moment, something inside me, quiet and small, began to fold in on itself. I had heard what I was never meant to hear, and I could never unhear it. Dinner was served with silver cutlery and polished plates, but nothing could mask the chill in the room. They sat me at the far end of the table, not quite at the head, not quite at the center, just off to the side, the place where no one has to pass you the bread or engage you too long in conversation, the seat given out of obligation, not invitation. The food looked beautiful, perfectly arranged, like something from a magazine, but when I picked up my fork, I couldn't taste a thing. Not because the food was bad, it wasn't, but because my mouth was dry, my stomach hollowed out from something deeper than hunger. I tried to chew, but every bite turned to ash. They talked around me, over me, through me. Conversations flowed between guests about ski trips and renovation projects, about their new espresso machine and the holiday gala. My son spoke loudly, laughing in that bright, performative way people do when they want to impress others. His wife matched his tone, her smile just wide enough to seem warm to those who didn't know better. I tried to join in. I waited for a pause, then offered a small memory. One of the years we built a snow fort in the backyard, my son bundled in that old blue coat with holes in the pockets. I thought it might bring a smile, maybe a laugh, maybe even connection. But halfway through my story, someone else chimed in about their Christmas in Paris, and the moment vanished like steam. My words dissolved into the clatter of forks and glasses. No one asked me to finish. The grandchildren sat across from me, poking at their food. They looked at me, then quickly looked away, like they weren't sure who I was anymore. One of them leaned toward their mother and whispered something. She gave a small shake of the head, then changed the subject. I caught a voice further down the table, hushed but careless. "Is that their father?" As if I were some distant relative no one could quite place. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile you wear to hide a bruise. I cut into my roast. The knife moved easily, but my hands felt numb. The laughter around me grew louder, but it only made the silence in my chest more profound. It struck me then. I had not been invited to share in their joy. I had been tolerated, positioned like an antique, a reminder of something old, something they didn't want to remember but couldn't quite throw away. I looked down the table at my son. He was laughing at something someone said, head thrown back, glass raised in celebration. His eyes never found mine, and in that moment I realized the most painful truth of all. I was a guest in the family I once built with my own hands. Unwanted, unwelcome, a memory they were trying to erase while I was still breathing. The room fell silent as my son stood, glass raised high, his voice bright and confident. To the future, to new traditions and a fresh chapter without holding on to the past. A ripple of applause swept through the guests, gentle claps washing over me like waves that never quite reached the shore. I lifted my own glass almost reflexively, the crystal cool against my palm, but I didn't drink. The liquid swirled, mocking me with its sparkle, reminding me how long it had been since I truly belonged. No one's eyes sought mine. No one smiled at me, not even the grandchildren who sat stiff as statues beside their parents. Their small faces, once alight with excitement at Grandpa's stories, were now blank canvases. As the warmth of the toast spread through the circle, I felt an ice storm blooming inside my chest. Each clap was a nail. "You're out of place," it said. "You're no longer part of this." A friend who had known my son since childhood raised his eyebrows, glanced at me, and then looked away. The carved wooden box I'd made sat between my plate and the fire, untouched and forgotten. I stared at it, memory flooding back, the late nights I spent whittling the compass rose, the pride I felt imagining my grandson filling it with treasures. Now its lid lay closed, as though whatever lay inside was no longer welcome. I lowered my glass, setting it softly on the table. My reflection shimmered in the polished surface, an old man alone in the midst of a celebration that had lost its meaning. The clink of unspoken betrayal echoed louder than any cheer, and I realized the toast had done more than break bread. It had broken something inside me that would never fully heal. That night, the laughter and music that had filled the house all evening now felt like distant echoes, fading behind a veil of strained politeness. The guests had retreated to corners of the living room, nursing their glasses and whispering half-forgotten stories, the festive glow dimmed by an undercurrent of tension. I sat on the love seat, the wooden box heavy in my lap, my coat still draped over the armrest, as though I'd never truly removed it. The fire burned low, embers glowing like guilty eyes, and I watched the shadows dance across the walls, shadows that seemed to mock me, stretching and shrinking as though they carried the shape of all I had lost. My son appeared beside me, his silhouette outlined by the hallway light. He cleared his throat softly, the only sound in the crowded, silent room. "Dad," his voice shook low and wary, "I think it's time you left. You don't fit in anymore. This isn't your home." Those words landed on me like a physical blow. My chest tightened, lungs struggling for air. I felt every inch of my body freeze. my fingers gripping the box so tightly that my knuckles ached, my legs numb beneath the coffee table. A tremor rippled through my lips, but no sound came. I could only nod, the motion stiff and deliberate, as if something within me had snapped into place. I rose slowly, the wooden box slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. Its lid popped open, revealing the carved compass rose and the empty space beneath. Empty, like the place I had once held in their hearts. My son turned away, the distance between us closing like an unbridgeable gulf, and I understood there was nothing left to say. I walked toward the door, each step echoing off the hardwood like a tolling bell. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with regret and relief all at once. I paused at the threshold, hand on the cold doorknob, and looked back. Faces blurred in the half-light, friends who had once welcomed me with open arms, grandchildren who used to cling to my coat pockets, a family that had slowly built walls around me until I was nothing more than a stranger. The door opened, and a rush of icy night air met me, sharp, honest, alive. I stepped outside, the snow beneath my boots soft and unforgiving. I didn't look back. I walked down the steps into the quiet street, the distant hum of the party fading until it was gone. In that silence, broken only by my own breath, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't known in years. Freedom from a place that never truly wanted me. I stood in the entryway, the muted glow of the hallway light quivering on the polished floorboards. My coat lay folded on the bench, thick, worn at the cuffs, the same one I'd worn each Christmas for the past decade. I slipped it on, my hands moving slowly as though I feared every stitch might unravel. The collar rose around my neck, cocooning me in a familiar weight. No hand reached out to help. No voice called my name or offered a last cup of cocoa. The only sound was the faint creak of the door as I pulled it closed behind me, shutting out the murmured conversations and the distant hum of holiday music. The lock clicked, a final punctuation mark on the night's cruel script. Outside, the world was hushed. Snow fell in lazy spirals, large lazy flakes that landed softly on my shoulders and whispered of cold truths. I inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp, unforgiving air. It burned my lungs, but it felt more honest than the stale warmth I just left behind. I began to walk, each footstep sinking into the white blanket. The streetlights cast halos on the snow, illuminating my solitary path. I didn't look back. I didn't want one last glance at the house where I'd once been the heart, where laughter had once chased away the darkness, where love had been the only illumination I needed. I pressed on, each step a statement. I am here. I exist. Even if they had erased me from their holiday, the world remained, silent witness to my departure. The wind picked up, threading its way through the bare branches of the trees and whipping at the edges of my coat. It carried away the echo of my footsteps, swallowing them in a breathless hush. And in that emptiness, I found a strange solace. The wind, unbiased, unyielding, heard my goodbye without judgment. It let my sorrow ride the currents, spreading it across the silent night sky. I paused on the sidewalk, head bowed against the flurry of snow. I closed my eyes and let the wind press its cold kiss to my cheeks. No tears fell. There was nothing left to lose, nothing left to mourn. My goodbye was wordless, held in the space between the falling flakes and the beating silence of my heart. Then I walked on, leaving their world behind, carried forward by the whisper of the wind and the strength I rediscovered with every step into the night. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the air inside shifted. The warmth drained away, replaced by a hollow stillness that made every breath feel heavy. I walked down the street, unable to hear, but somehow knowing that something had changed in the house I'd just left. Back inside, coats and glasses trembled on tables as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Then, as if propelled by some moral impulse, an old family friend rose from his chair. His voice cut through the lingering holiday playlist, sharp with disbelief. He reminded them, everyone, that the man they'd just cast out had been the one who carried this family when his wife died, raising a boy with love and sacrifice. At first his words hung alone in the silent room, and then one by one other voices joined in. A woman who had once leaned on my shoulder during hard times spoke of my quiet kindness. A neighbor remembered the nights I spent shoveling snow for everyone on the block, my back aching but my spirit unbroken. Slowly, the guests rose from their seats, coats slipping from shoulders as they moved toward the front door, each step an act of solidarity, each raised voice a hammer striking falsehood. Their words started low, almost mournful, but grew louder, demanding accountability, justice, respect. The laughter that had once masked their discomfort was gone. In its place, sorrow for what they'd witnessed, anger at what they'd allowed. A mother of 2 children spoke of how proud she had always been of the old man's resilience. A cousin, tears in her eyes, recalled the Christmases when he baked cookies for everyone and told stories that made even the sternest grown-ups smile. In that charged silence, the truth echoed through every polished surface. The man they'd shunned was not an embarrassment, but the living heart of the family. Guilt and shame pooled in the center of the room like spilled wine. Plates sat half-finished, untouched by hands, now too ashamed to lift a fork. The guests moved as one toward coats, to step out into the snow, abandoning the festive tablescape that no longer felt right. Outside, the wind carried the faintest murmur of their departure, each door closing behind them like the punctuation of a sentence too late realized. And in that moment, though I could not see it, I felt their solidarity reach me. A ripple carried on cold air, affirming that I was not invisible, that my life, my love, my sacrifices still mattered to those who had true hearts. The shift was swift and seismic. In the hush that followed the friend's rebuke, coats were yanked from coat racks and slipped over shoulders, scarves wound hastily around necks. A ripple of footsteps moved toward the door, soft at first, then gathering momentum like a wave cresting before it breaks. I felt it in the crisp night air, as though their resolve had chased me out, even though I stood yards away, hidden by snowfall. From inside, voices rose with firm finality. "I won't celebrate with someone who abandons their own father," declared one guest, her words cutting through the festive nerves that lingered like ghosts. Another, voice thick with emotion, murmured, "I knew your dad in '83. He worked 2 jobs to keep you fed," reminding everyone of the sacrifices that had built the very life they now tried to erase. Plates were abandoned mid-bite, glasses half raised, ornaments on the mantel caught in the touch of finality. The chandelier's light, once warm and inviting, now swung gently over empty chairs and a silent table. In a matter of heartbeats, the beautifully decorated living room, so meticulously arranged for a joyous gathering, stood deserted, as though struck by grief instead of celebration. Only my son and his wife remained, frozen amid the festooned garlands and twinkling lights, their eyes wide with disbelief, mouths parted as if wanting to speak but finding no words. The world they had crafted for themselves felt brittle in that instant, shattering like crystal under the weight of collective conscience. And outside, in the silent snowfall, I felt their absence more poignantly than any harsh word, an affirmation that though they had turned their backs on me, the truth of who I was still shone brighter than any bauble on their tree. The snow muffled my footsteps as I trudged down the deserted street, each breath visible in the frozen air like a fragile wisp of regret. My shoulders sagged under the weight of the pie in my hand, its crust still warm, a cruel reminder of the generosity I'd brought into a home that no longer wanted me. I had no idea what had just unfolded behind closed doors. I only knew I felt hollow, as though I had left a piece of myself on that polished floor. Yet there were no tears to blur my vision, no hot anger to drive me onward, just a profound fatigue, the kind that seeps into every muscle and bone, leaving you too weary to even feel the sharpest sorrow. Street lamps cast golden pools on the drifted snow, illuminating my quiet journey, but their glow seemed distant, illuminating a world that no longer reflected my place in it. The pie's aroma drifted from its foil wrapper in soft spirals of cinnamon and sugar, and for a moment I recalled my wife's laughter as she tasted the first slice each year. I thought about how, in happier times, we'd shared that warmth together. Now the scent haunted me more than it comforted me. Cars passed, headlights trailing through the night like comets, but no one slowed. No one offered a ride. The world moved around me, unseen, and I welcomed the anonymity. It suited me better than the forced smiles and cold courtesy I'd endured. My footsteps left a single, solitary track behind me, each print a quiet testament. I was here. I mattered. Even if only to the empty street, I existed. I rounded the corner toward my small apartment building, its brick facade glowing dimly in the distance. I thought of the neighbors who, unaware of the evening's cruelty, would hang fresh wreaths on their doors, children pressing against frosted windows in wonder. They would never know the story behind the old man who passed by in silence. I climbed the steps to my apartment. My breath labored and slow, and I paused on the threshold. The door swung open, and I stepped inside, setting the pie on the kitchen table as though laying down a shield. I removed my coat and folded it carefully, draping it over the back of a chair. Then I sat, alone, unmoved, and let the silence settle around me like a blanket. Outside, the snow continued its gentle fall, indifferent and pure. And in that moment, carrying both my pie and my silence, I felt a stillness wash over me that no family gathering could ever achieve again. The knock came just as I was settling into the quiet hush of my apartment, the one place where no family could turn their back on me. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, staring down at the pie's golden crust, torn between relief and the same hollow ache that had followed me all evening. The knock sounded again, more insistent, yet gentle, like a heartbeat against my door. I rose slowly, each movement deliberate, and opened it to find my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patel, her eyes rimmed red with sympathy, a loaf of fresh bread cradled in her arms. Behind her stood Mr. Alvarez from 3 doors down, carrying a thermos of soup that steamed in the chill hallway. And then, as though summoned by their courage, came the tall man from the party, Michael, the one who had stood and spoken up when everyone else remained silent. In his hand he held nothing but a folded blanket and the weight of his own regret. They stepped inside without waiting for invitation, filling the small space with warmth and purpose. Mrs. Patel set the bread on the table and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. Mr. Alvarez poured the soup into bowls, the rich aroma of garlic and vegetables cutting through the stale sorrow. Michael stood by the window, arms crossed against the cold memory of laughter turned cruel, and said softly, "We heard what happened. You didn't deserve that." His words trembled in the air but held steady like a promise. I wanted to speak, to tell them how each moment of the evening had unraveled me, how my heart had lodged itself somewhere between shame and disbelief. But my voice caught in my throat, so I simply nodded and let tears, long held at bay, slip down my cheeks. They didn't rush away, they pooled like gentle rain, grounding me in a kindness I had feared lost. They gathered around the table, 3 faces full of compassion, 3 lights in the darkness of that night. Mrs. Patel handed me a slice of bread. It tasted of hope. Mr. Alvarez offered a steaming spoonful of soup. It tasted of belonging. Michael placed his hand on my shoulder. It felt like an anchor, steady and real. In that small apartment, filled with food and warmth and whispered apologies, I realized that family is not only defined by blood or brittle traditions, but by the grace extended in moments of deepest need. And as the 3 of them stayed long into the night, trading stories of better days and plans for tomorrow, I felt the first true comfort I had known since that cruel door had closed behind me. The next morning dawned gray and silent, but my doorbell shattered that stillness. A young woman stood on my worn rug, her notebook open, recorder poised like a lifeline. She introduced herself as a reporter from the local paper. Someone had posted snippets of last night online, and the story had struck a nerve across town. She asked if she could ask me a few questions, and though I felt raw and uncertain, I nodded. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd laid down the pie hours earlier, now cleared except for 2 steaming cups of tea. Her recorder's little red light blinked, waiting. I folded my hands on the table and gazed out the window at the snow-dusted street, gathering the right words. She asked me about my son's house, about the party, about how I came to be shunned on Christmas Eve. I answered softly, each syllable carrying the weight of a life lived in service of others. Words about sacrifice, about loss, about the years spent keeping a family together after my wife's passing. But the moment that made her eyes fill with tears and later would make readers pause in cafes and bus stops was when I said, my voice so low it trembled, all I ever wanted was to be there. Those few words landed like hollow echoes in the quiet room. The reporter lowered her pen. The recorder captured the hush that followed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she thanked me, carefully packing away her equipment, and left with a promise that she'd let me know when the story ran. Alone again, I poured the remainder of my tea into the sink and leaned against the counter, hands braced on cool tile. I thought of how simple those words were, yet how deeply they resonated. To be there, to witness birthdays, to share laughter, to carve out memories with the people you love. It seemed a basic human need, so pure and unassuming. And yet last night it had been enough to render me unwelcome. Later that day I heard from neighbors and friends who had read the article's headline, "Father Rejected on Christmas. All I ever wanted was to be." There, splashed across the front page, encouraging messages slid into my phone. Visitors arrived with warm meals and hugs. It was as if my words had unlocked something compassionate in everyone who read them. A reminder that love, quiet, steadfast, enduring, is the greatest gift we can offer and receive. And though the hurt of yesterday still pressed heavily on my chest, I felt a new warmth growing. The warmth of being seen, truly seen by an entire community who understood at last that the greatest injustice is keeping someone who loves you from simply being where they belong. Snow still clung to rooftops when my phone began to buzz with messages from strangers, an outpouring so vast it felt like the entire town had woken up to care. On social media, threads formed under my simple quote, "All I ever wanted was to be there." Neighbors I'd waved to for years shared stories of their own parents, widowed grandparents who spent holidays alone, veterans whose families had drifted away, and immigrants who scrimped and sacrificed to give their children a future. Each post carried the same undercurrent of regret, how easily we forget the quiet heroes in our midst. By midday, my tiny apartment became a slow-moving carousel of compassion. A local baker arrived with boxes of warm rolls and sweet buns. A florist from down the street left a bouquet, pinks and whites bound with ribbon, on my doorstep. Letters poured in, handwritten notes on cheery stationery, each one apologizing for being too busy to notice, too polite to speak up, or too wrapped up in their own lives to remember that beneath the costumes of parent, grandparent, volunteer, or neighbor, we are all just people yearning for connection. Community leaders organized a small gathering in the park, inviting anyone who'd been touched by the story to bring photos of their elders to hang on a makeshift wall of gratitude. I watched from a distance as photos drifted in, sepia-toned images of stoic-faced soldiers, black and white school portraits, snapshots of wives and husbands now long past. One by one, people stepped forward to speak of sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. Late-night vigils, extra shifts, the cost of college tuition paid out of a thinning checking account. I felt tears on my cheeks, not for sorrow this time, but for the collective awakening that had taken root. Meanwhile, word reached my son. He started seeing the posts on his own feed, the hashtags multiplying, the calls for kindness echoing in comments and reposts. Friends who had once attended the party tagged him in articles and heartfelt posts. "You can never unhear what you ignored," wrote one. "Remember who built your home," reminded another. He grew quieter each day, the confident planner of new traditions, shrinking under the weight of his community's disapproval. I sensed his shame before he ever reached out. His messages hovered unanswered, drafts he couldn't bring himself to send. And though my heart still carried the sting of his rejection, I felt a tender hope that through the town's compassion he might one day learn to carry justice in his own heart. The knock at my door was tentative, almost hesitant, as if the person on the other side feared what he might find. I stood in the dim foyer of my apartment, the afternoon light filtering through frosted glass, and opened the door to see my son. Pale as the snow he had forced me into, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of unspoken guilt. His eyes were rimmed with red, a silent confession more powerful than any words. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice cracking. "Dad, I was wrong. I was proud. I thought you were holding me back, but you were holding me up all along." His words fell into the quiet room like fragile ornaments, cracking under pressure. I felt the memories tumble through me, his first tentative steps, scraped knees pressed against my shirt, late nights when I sat beside his bed, praying for his dreams to come true. I remembered the winter I worked 2 jobs to pay for his college application fees, the long Christmases after his mother died when he and I were all each other had. He looked to the floor, expression haunted by the pictures painted on every timeline, heard in every echo of the town's outrage and compassion. He had watched, finally, as the world stood up for me in the way he never did. Now he stood before me, shivering in the hallway light, hoping for absolution. I said nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick, reverent, alive. In that hush I saw the tremor in his chest slow, the walls around his heart crack open, and though my lips remained still, my heart spoke volumes. The doorway between us, once a threshold of rejection, now felt like the first step toward something neither of us had dared to hope for. The air in the hallway felt impossibly still as I met my son's gaze one last time. My voice emerged soft, but steady. "I forgive you, but I'm done waiting to be loved." Each word fell like a gentle exhale, releasing years of hurt and longing into the quiet afternoon. He looked at me, hope and remorse flickering in his eyes, but I could see I no longer needed his forgiveness to find my own peace. I turned from the door and stepped back into the warm glow of my apartment, pausing only to close the door gently behind me. There was no slam, no angry echo of rejection, just the soft click of wood meeting frame. I let the hallway's chill fade away as I made my way to the hearth, where embers still glowed faintly in the ashes of last night's fire. For the first time in years, I didn't carry a burden of expectation. I laid my coat aside, its weight light now, and settled into the armchair I'd claimed long ago. The wooden box and the pie sat undisturbed on the side table, symbols of a past that had shaped me but no longer defined me. I reached out and touched the familiar throw draped over the chair's back, the one my wife once knitted with love and laughter. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the dying embers rise into my chest, filling every hollow space with quiet gratitude. The world outside continued its rhythm, but here, in this room steeped in memory and healing, I was finally free. And as I breathed in the gentle glow of the fire, I realized that peace, once so elusive, had always been waiting for me at home.